welcome for joining us today. I'm very excited to have Jacinta Chick from our Brisbane office joining us in the presentation today. Don't know that she's very excited, I must admit. I think it was a straw poll and she lost, so she's on here to talk with us today. So be nice to her all, because I think she's very nervous about being in this format. But welcome, Jacinta, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I mean, I would love to say it's great to be here, but yeah, pretty nervous.
Oh, come on. It's nice to catch up with everyone. All right, so we've obviously got a couple of different topics that we want to run through, but just for those, as I like to do, give a bit of an update of what we're seeing from the insolvency industry point of view. I guess the first thing that I wanted to highlight is a lot of you would be seeing in the press now. We're seeing a lot of big companies starting to show up in the press. We've had Porter Davis recently. We had the Lloyd Group a couple of hours after that. I saw one of the big sushi chains based in New South Wales. And I think they're in Canberra and Darwin as well. They went down yesterday by a court appointment. Interestingly, they didn't get any of the right advice and let the court do it for them. So we're seeing a lot of the bigger companies hitting the press. What I wanted to really highlight, though, is it's actually the second tier people that are the ones that you need to be keeping an eye on. So where most of our market is not the big ones that you see hit the press. Although we have worked on some larger projects, but where the real issues come is the mum and dads that are hurt by these ones falling over. So within your databases now, you'll regularly be seeing a lot of people are being hurt by it, and that's where we think the real drama is going to come over the next couple of months. Certainly the insolvency numbers have pretty much returned now to the pre-pandemic levels. They have what they call a base number, which is the average of 17, 18 and 19. And for the last 6 months, the insolvency numbers have been hitting about those numbers of pre-pandemic. That, to me, unfortunately, is not showing the true picture yet. So what we're seeing is a real increase in data collection. We're seeing a lot more CSDs coming through. We're seeing a lot more letters of demand and a lot more wind-ups hitting the presses or hitting the reports. That's not actually hitting, the wind-ups are hitting the listings, but the CSDs and all that sort of stuff isn't hitting there yet. So there is a real undercurrent of pressure that's coming. I was even talking to an accountant yesterday where one of their clients got a CSD and they went, they hadn't even been sending us warning letters. So in some cases now what we're finding is that they're just going hard. So you really need to be keeping a close eye on clients that may be in a little bit of stress. So we do have our in-person webinars and we go through a lot more of the detail of the numbers in that. So if you haven't seen the invites for that yet, please have a look on the website, on our website, and then you can register for the various functions that we have around the country. So we'll get into today. Jacinta's sitting there nervously, not wanting this to start, but it's happening, Jacinta. So we'll get stuck into it. So before we get into the topics, though, as I mentioned at the start, you're a strategist in our Brisbane office, and I think it's about 5 years you've been with us now.
Yeah, I've been around for about 5 years, but I wasn't always a strategist. I did previously. I spent some time in the operations team, and this team, their primary focus is the implementation of our strategies. So that's probably one of the things that really differentiate us from other firms who work in this space, is that we have a whole team that is dedicated to that implementation and really supporting clients through the process.
And I must admit, here on the webinar, when we talk about it, we don't really go into a lot of detail about just how important that operations role is to how we implement our plans. But it is a critical part of our process and what we try and achieve every day.
I mean, well, it's one thing to come up with a plan, but really to execute it is where we have a lot of value to add. This team that we have, they work in it day in, day out, and their experience, they sometimes there's twists and turns with our clients' projects, but they're always on top of it. And, you know, we can adjust to these changing circumstances.
And I love how you said sometimes.
Probably more often than not.
There's always something, isn't there? Yeah. So I guess when we look at the topics that we're going to cover today, which is around, you know, what actions we can take before insolvency, why asset protection is so valuable, and, you know, why liquidation doesn't have to be the end of the road for a lot of people. I know some of the things that we're going to be talking about aren't just coming from the strategist point of view or the plan point of view. It's actually coming from what you've seen at the implementation end as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, look, it's really great when we get to meet with a client who has a good plan B in place. You know, they can approach us, we can help them implement it, and then they leave in a better position.
So before we jump into our first client, I just wanted to say to everyone listening, if you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat box. I'll have a look at that as we're going along. If I think it's going to be answered as we go, then I'll let it slide. If it's something that we need to jump in, I'll do that as well. Otherwise, we will have some time for some questions at the end as well. So, all right, so let's jump into some client scenarios and just try and sort of flesh out what we're talking about here. Obviously, we're not going to use any names, but why don't we start with a client that I know that you've just finished up with, who is Perth-based. Now, I know this client went through a restructure and a liquidation, but really it's the personal stuff that we want to focus on, that I want to focus on today.
Look, first, I'll just give you a tiny bit of background. Right? This client had two companies that we needed to deal with at a corporate level. Their financial hardship was mainly caused by a major debtor who fell over, and they ended up taking a hit for over $500,000. It's probably the interesting point is that they probably could have gotten through it unharmed had they have dealt with it straight away. But at the time, they still believed that there was quite a good chance that they would recover some money. Look, long story short, they did keep carrying on for a little while. They used the ATO as their bank, and you know, they were waiting for money that just didn't come.
Yeah, I think they'd got some advice that there was going to be a good return in the liquidation, so they effectively banked on that requirement, didn't they? And it's a real shame because it's you know, people take the advice based on what they think they hear from some of these people, and it doesn't quite work out. But the other thing we're hearing a lot about is this, the ATO being used as the unofficial overdraft. That's getting a little bit out of control, I would say, at the moment, but that's a conversation for another webinar. So sorry, I'll let you continue with your background.
Yeah, well, look, in this case, we needed to restructure the group. And like you said, I know you've spoke about that plenty of times on our webinars previously and our in-person seminars. So I won't go through too many details, but I just wanted to say that, as you know, look, we don't just stop at a corporate level when we put together a strategy for a client. There definitely needs to be a heavy focus on the director's personal position. And in fact, most of our strategies are kind of tailored around mitigating that personal exposure. In this case, the client, he had two properties, so a pretty substantial asset position.
Yeah, so I mean, it's so true when you look at the corporate stuff. We see a lot of clients, you know, they go, I've got a company in trouble, so they go and get advice on the company. But it's these days with personal guarantees, with claims. There's no, the separation between that corporate veil that I've often talked about is so thin and flimsy these days that if you don't cover off on both sides, you're going to end up in trouble. So I assume that the properties that you're talking about were in his name and he was the director. Yeah,
that's right. Unfortunately, I suppose it's the usual story. He was the director. He's taking on the risks associated with the business, as well as owning these properties, which is unfortunate. But look, it can still be dealt with. It's not to say that it's not manageable. In this case, because of the liquidations, which we knew were inevitable, the director, we knew he was going to face some personal exposure from the liquidator.
All right. So I'm going to stop you again. If we knew that there was going to be exposure, why would we recommend to go down a path that we know that was going to create exposure? I mean, again, we hear a lot about people being told that they need to do a VA and DOCA because that avoids that type of exposure.
Look, I mean, it's a good question, but ultimately, I suppose when we're creating a plan for a client, it really can come down to what the most cost-effective path is going to be. In this case, we do definitely look into the opportunity to do a VA or a DOCA. But, of course, the DOCA's success is kind of reliant on getting those votes up, and without going into too many details, we weren't particularly confident that we would have the numbers. And then, the company would end up in liquidation in any case. I mean, that's also not to mention that the financial impacts of the DOCA contribution that would have made the future of the company a little bit uncertain.
Yeah, so really what you're saying is that with the right plan, it's okay to almost plan for claims coming, because you can, rather than trying to avoid them and spend all the money to avoid them, actually going headlong into them can actually be the best result sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, we anticipated the claims, and therefore having that personal strategy in place was very important. At a personal level, we sort of focused on what the liquidator would look at when they were to make a claim. Again, in this case, he had 2 properties that he had an interest in. So in any negotiations, people making a claim are going to sort of assess what the likely return is going to be.
So and again, given that you thought that there was some equity in the property, and I would assume that meant that when we looked at what the liquidator would do, the liquidator would see that there was something to go after. So what did you do to sort of counteract that?
Yeah, well, look, in this case, the focus was to sell the equity or the perceived equity in the properties to a third party. And we actually did this for a couple of reasons. The first is because selling the equity, we could change the title of the properties. So this was important because, again, there was a lot of risk for this director personally. He'd signed several trade credit applications, and some of those creditors, we were concerned that they would have the ability to lodge a caveat over his properties. So, no properties, no caveat. But I mean, I will mention, of course, this is not necessarily going to stop action from creditors, but I think it's obviously just going to deter them, and they're coming at it from an unknown sort of perspective. They don't know what the recovery is going to be like.
Yeah, it makes sense, really. I mean, if I'm a creditor with a caveat, then I know I've got a higher chance of recovery. Removing that opportunity to have a caveat puts our clients and us in a better negotiation position, really, doesn't it? What was the second reason why you wanted to go down that path?
Well, look, whilst we knew that there was going to be potential claims from the liquidator, but this personal asset protection strategy, it offers protection from claims of any kind. It really just makes them less appealing to run when we negotiate with anyone, particularly a liquidator. Generally, it's they're usually pretty commercial, and they look at it from the perspective of what they're likely to recover. In theory, why would someone spend time and resources running a claim that they're not likely to recover anything on? So we sold the equity in the property, and by doing so, we can present an asset and liability position which shows that there are no material assets to chase. So the director, he can then sort of put forward a settlement offer which can look quite appealing and offer a greater return than what you could expect to receive through other methods.
Yeah, and I guess I think you mentioned that there was a personal asset protection strategy. Really, this is probably not quite a protection strategy as much as it's a negotiation strategy. It really gives us the ability to go, hey, look, the guy's really got nothing. So if you want to spend 20 grand, 30 grand chasing him, there's nothing to get. So it's, and most people, when they're commercial, you can come to a resolution on that. But, we've all seen, both probably people listening and us certainly, where some people take it emotionally and they just want to hurt the person. And it doesn't matter whether there's any money or not. So, I mean, that's a different facet that you need to play with. But when you're dealing with these type of claims, it's about commerciality, not the emotions. So So all of that makes sense to me, obviously, or you'd hope it makes sense to me, I guess. But so how did everything play out in this case?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to sit here in front of all these people and talk about something that didn't go to plan. So naturally, yes, we had time to complete the equity deed. We obtained the valuations, payments were made by the purchasing entity. Again, that's probably one of the benefits in getting in contact with clients early on and having a little bit of time, prior to an insolvency event, is that we had the time to address these things. The liquidation occurred, and as we anticipated, there were some claims. So there was a little bit of back and forth here and there, threats to go to legal proceedings, all the usual stuff that you can expect. But eventually, the director, he presented a settlement offer. It was a fair compromise, and there was a little bit of further back and forth, but eventually we agreed on a settlement, and the director, he paid his settlement sum, and we could close off the matter on our end.
Yeah. Okay. So, and we haven't used any numbers here, but I know that this was sort of like a 5 cent in the dollar settlement on what he had to deal with. So it was a really good result. So thank you for sharing it. But I do have one question. You talked about, and I think this is just really want to highlight why, with this sort of stuff, is that there were plenty of threats. You talked about there being threats and potential claims, and that can be really stressful for a client. Now, we talk a lot about how we try and take that pressure off and hold our clients' hands through that. But, I know that some of those letters of demands can be written very well to scare the pants off people and particularly off our clients. How did the client handle that, given that we were actually putting them further under the bus in that scenario?
Well, look, that's an interesting one. Of course, we're here and we're involved to hold our client's hand through the process. But that's not to say that we're not going to encounter some kind of scary stuff throughout. So when we came up with the plan, with the strategy, we anticipated that there was going to be some claims. So, we discussed this with the director. He was aware that this would likely be the case. And he knew that I had a plan to deal with it at the end of the day. So when the letters came, it wasn't a surprise. He even, he read them and said, oh yeah, this is what you were talking about. So he definitely stomached it a lot better in that sense.
Yeah, well, that's again, it's about the knowing, the unknowns, what's really scares people. So I guess for me, just two things I wanted to highlight from that story is that having the time before a liquidation to put some of these things in place is really critical to ensure that you get the best result. We're not saying you're still not going to have to pay some money out, or there's going to be some cost to the process. But what we are saying is that the more time you got to plan, the less ridiculous or the less hurtful that needs to be. And I guess the other thing is that we do have a lot of advisors or a lot of referrers who are often told that the only way to go is a VA and a DOCA because it avoids claims and attacking of the director. But if you know what you're doing and you're pre-planning it well, then dealing with the director is actually not always going to be. Dealing with the claims can actually be a really good result. I will move on now, if I can, Jacinta, to this another job that we wanted to talk about that I know you got a lot of joy out of this. It's a long process, but you got a lot of joy out of this when you help someone get through a Section 73 compromise. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know what a compromise, 73 compromise is, we will go through that shortly. But can I just get you to set the scene on this job, please? Yeah,
of course. This was, like you said, it was a really great one. It was nearly 3 years in the making. I think the client approached us initially late 2019, and he had a business that had been running for a number of years quite successfully, and there was just sort of a bit of a sudden downturn. So we provided him with some advice on a controlled exit from the business, and he had given several personal guarantees. So in line with that, we also recommended that he look into bankruptcy following the liquidation. So controlled exit and then the eventual liquidation, this sort of aspect of the project was not overly complex. I mean, like any project, there were a few issues here and there that we worked through at the time, but sort of all was in order. I will say though, I'm sure that most people would, feel the same way, but the thought of bankruptcy is not one that he was particularly keen on.
Oh, well, no. I think it's really, no one ever considers bankruptcy as their first option, is it? So, I met with a client yesterday. We recommended bankruptcy, but the poor guy was fretting because of all the misinformation about what bankruptcy is. But we'll talk about that at some point as well. But yes, it's certainly not their choice. But anyway, yeah, go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, this client, he really, like I said, he really struggled with the idea of bankruptcy, and he was holding out hope that he could address the personal guarantees once he got a secure job. So he battled with this for about 6 months, trying to deal with creditors following the liquidation. But long story short, he kept in contact with us all the meantime, and eventually he agreed, even just for his peace of mind, that it was the way to go. So, straight away we got stuck into preparing him for bankruptcy.
Getting ready for bankruptcy. So, again, a lot of people hear say that it's just a matter of just hitting a button and you go bankrupt. But it's not. There's a lot more to it. So, loaded question. It's not just as easy as going bankrupt, is it?
Well, I mean, sure, in some cases it can be. People might just need a hand filling out the forms, and it can all be fairly simple. Just like anything, it really just depends on the circumstances and what the long-term goals are. In this case, we didn't have to deal with equity and houses or cars, but he did have the opportunity to earn quite a substantial income moving forward. So we prepared him for bankruptcy with the intention that we may consider a Section 73 compromise down the track. And this was an option that he wanted to keep available.
Right, so I'll get you to explain 73 now. But before you do, Phil, again, he's going nuts on the typing. So Phil asked the question, do controlled exits always involve a bankruptcy? The answer is no, doesn't have to. It depends on the circumstances, whether it's needed or not. In this case, there was potentially a couple of 100,000 in creditors that had the ability through their PGs to come after him. And now your next question, Phil, is I'll get you, Jacinta, to just explain what a 73 compromise is.
Sure. So if successful, a Section 73 compromise essentially allows a bankrupt to finalise their bankruptcy ahead of schedule. So what they would do is, via their bankruptcy trustee, they would propose, some kind of monetary offer, which would then go to a vote of creditors. So if the offer is accepted, then the bankruptcy is finalised early. When creditors are reviewing this proposal, they're going to compare what the likely return is in bankruptcy if the bankrupt was to continue for the remaining term, or what the offer on the table is. And sometimes this offer is an upfront sum, maybe a portion of it's upfront and the rest of a repayment plan. It's, again, very much depending on the circumstances, but in order for it to be successful, in most cases, you would expect that the offer needs to be at least equal to or greater than the return in bankruptcy. Yeah,
which in a lot of cases is not a lot. So it's, and we'll talk through this case a little bit more, but it's a bit like, you hear people say that they have their marriages annulled. So it's almost like the bankruptcy never occurred. So, it can certainly be a good option in some cases. But talk us through what happened in this case.
Well, look, prior to the client going bankrupt, he did have a few creditors who were chasing him, and he was having trouble dealing with them as is. So imagine if more were to surface, then he would have an even greater issue. So again, in preparing him for bankruptcy, it was important that we captured all of the creditors. That includes related parties and particularly supportive creditors, because this is actually what ended up helping us successfully get the composition offer up later on.
So talk to me about supportive creditors, because it's a funny term that we use more than is actually a technical term.
Yeah, so often what happens when a creditor gets notice of a bankruptcy, they might just close off their file without even submitting a proof of debt. In their mind, it's unrecoverable, and they just don't want to spend any more time on the matter. So then in future, if we are to propose a Section 73 offer, they might not even turn up to the meeting. And then in that case, we don't get the votes. So ensuring that we do have enough supportive creditors that will vote in favour of the proposal, that is something that's really important to our long-term goal. So in this case, we submitted the bankruptcy form. There was about a dozen creditors and potential creditors that he believed he'd provided personal guarantees to. But in the end, only 2 ended up submitting a proof of debt in the estate, and both of these 2 were supportive creditors.
It's actually something that's really interesting, and we often talk about, and I think for a lot of people listening, they would have heard me that with clients that are going into bankruptcy, I often ring them up on the day, after all the paperwork's submitted and it's lodged and accepted. I'll often ring them up and say, congratulations. They don't quite get that on day one, like they sort of do, because I tell the story, but about a week later, they go, my phone stopped ringing. Everything just stops when that happens. And I think it's a really, I've had clients that have been so scared of their phone ringing that when it does ring, when the phone does ring, it sends some people into a panic when they're chasing through all this different, with all these different scenarios. So, that whole benefit of the phone stopping when it rings, but it creates problems for us if we're not prepared for it. So that's what a supportive creditor is. I think it's important that it's, everybody understands what that is. So let's talk about what were the next steps. How did this all play out?
Well, look, this client, he just went about his business and he slowly sort of got back on his feet. After about 9 months, he did end up getting a job in his field of expertise, and it was pretty well paid. He knew that because he was earning an additional income, he would be liable to make some income contributions, and he was okay with that. But the issue was that the job had the potential to expand. His management team, they were pushing him to take on more official roles within the company. And, this included directorships and the opportunity to become a shareholder. So, naturally at that point, it was time for us to start considering the Section 73. We put an offer together based on his estimated income contributions that he would have had to make over the following 2 years. So he was liable to pay about $54,000 in contributions, and we offered a sum of $40,000 up front as part of our Section 73 offer. Yep. This offer, it was sent to all the creditors. And again, only 2 showed up to the meeting to vote, and they were the 2 supportive creditors that I mentioned earlier. It was his accountant and solicitor, funnily enough. Look, I suppose the risk with him losing his employment, right, that was a little bit of incentive for creditors to really consider, provided we had some unrelated ones that popped up, that would have been an incentive for them to consider this Section 73.
Yeah, and I think, that I guess the little bit that we haven't talked about in there is that when we put the offer up, the trustee in bankruptcy has to actually make a recommendation to the creditors as to whether they accept it or not. So when they write their report saying, here's what you're going to get, this is what the offer is, we think it's good, bad, or indifferent, that's part of that process. So obviously the trustee would recommend it. So
of course.
So you mentioned that the bankrupt was liable for income contributions, and for some people, I guess they again, there's this complete fallacy around what bankruptcy is. And so just for a little bit of clarity, I know that some people get it, others don't. In bankruptcy, you can actually earn whatever money you like. So there is no threshold on what you can earn. Where the threshold or it comes in is that over a certain income level based on your dependents and a number of other things, you have a threshold of income over which you need to make contributions back to your trustee's estate. And it's 50% of your net amount that's over that amount. So, I mean, I've had clients come to me saying, I can't accept this job because it will put me over the threshold. And it's illegal for me to earn over that money. And it's like, that's not the case. So just try and dispel as many of the rumours around it as we can. Take it to another point though, you said that, so you made an offer of 40 grand, the contributions would have been 54. So really our client was only saving $14,000. Why would he even look at it for 14 grand?
Well, look, again, in this case, it was less about the financial saving and more about the job opportunities moving forward. So because the composition was accepted and he was released from bankruptcy, he could go forward in this company, without being restricted. Yep. That was really what was important to him at the time.
Yeah, okay. So it was the future potential that he really wanted to open up for himself. Really what we're trying to say is it's another great example of where the whole picture is important. It's not just the short term dealing with the company. I mean, we could have dealt with this client's company 4 years ago and just walked away, but the real result actually takes 3 years to plan out. And again, he knew what it was. So having both the short term and long term solutions is critical. That pre-planning is certainly the difference in how it all plays out.
Yeah, actually, that's right. I mean, I really want to stress that implementing these plans that are based off an understanding of how things are likely to unfold. I mean, that's, in my view, is how we can achieve the best result for clients.
You sound like there's a little bit of a loaded, you've got a bit of a trepidation in your voice over saying that. What are you trying to get to? Yeah,
let me answer that by telling you another quick story, okay? I'm currently assisting a client. It's still an ongoing matter. And he thought that he would be a little bit tricky and tackle some of this pre-insolvency planning himself.
Right.
So when he realized that he was getting into a bit of trouble, he took matters into his own hands. And he had the right idea, but he just didn't go about the execution very well. So what he did, or what he wanted to do, was sell the shares and equity that he owned in a company across to his wife, as he was facing bankruptcy. Look, again, the way that he went about it, that really created some additional headaches for us that we're still trying to resolve now. We're working pretty closely with him.
So he now come to us to try and fix the problems. All right. So you're going to need to explain, let's go through the scenario a bit with our audience.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, as I mentioned, it's still sort of playing out as we speak now. But what he effectively did was move his business into a new entity without getting the proper valuations and without documenting the transaction at the time. Look, they did pay some consideration for the business, but there's certainly questions being asked as to what the actual value was at the time of the transaction. So what the real kicker is that the entity that he moved the business into, unbeknownst to him, he was a shareholder of. And as I mentioned, there was a liquidation and then a bankruptcy, and all of a sudden he's a shareholder of this company that has a profitable trading business in it. So, obviously that's not what he wanted. And look, it was always their intention that the wife was to be the shareholder of this company, and it was just a bit of an administrative error, right? That he in fact was. So, look, again, there was no consideration paid for those shares, none, and so that's the fight that we're having at the moment.
Right. So he's now trying to say, "Oh, it was just a mistake. Poor sir, please just let me just transfer the shares for nothing." Because they did transfer him before he went bankrupt. But then now they're going, well, you didn't do the, where's the value in the shares? And that was after he put a company in an empty shell that now created value for those shares.
Yeah, of course. I mean, provided he didn't move the business, it would not have been as much of an issue.
I want to be clear for everyone listening, we had nothing to do with this pre-planning.
No.
But when the claims came, now Jacinta's heavily involved in trying to help fix it, because they came to us going, oh, can you try and fix this for us? Sorry, yes. So it was
no, that's right. Look, it definitely wasn't our doing. It was something that we were only sort of made aware of after the liquidation and the bankruptcy. So now what we're trying to do, or what we're dealing with, is claims from the liquidator against the wife's company for an undervalued sale in regards to the business, and then also from the bankruptcy trustee against the wife because the share transfer, which was done for no consideration. So it's interesting.
Yeah, well, it's and I think that's, I mean, look, it's a really good example of why it's about making sure you get the right pre-advice, isn't it, and getting that right early phase stuff. We're certainly not playing from a position of strength on this one, are we?
No, not particularly, but we'll give it our best shot.
All right, so it's that old adage, it's never too late to get us involved, but the earlier we get in, the more that we can actually control and get things better. Look, Jacinta, for someone who didn't want to be here, you're doing a really good job of having a chat with us. So, but we are running out of time now, and I've really enjoyed the examples of the clients that you've highlighted today. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that you want to say before you can put an end to this trauma of your life?
Well, look, I know we say this all the time, but I suppose if anyone has any clients that are experiencing financial distress or that you think will be in the near future, please, now is definitely the time to put them in contact with us. So I suppose these case studies in particular probably highlight the benefits in this early intervention. So, the overall outcomes can certainly be improved if we can get in there and get involved sooner rather than later. We're always happy to have a sit down and a chat with your clients and just review their circumstances. They might not need to engage us straight away, but of course, it's better to have that plan B in mind. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jacinta. You've done a whole lot better than I think you thought you could. And, I've actually really enjoyed having you on today. So I guess for me, one of the things that I really wanted to wrap up with today is a lot of people put Jonge Read, put us in the category that we're at the insolvency end of the scale, so that it's, if someone needs to go into liquidation, you're choosing between a liquidator and Jonge Read. That's at sort of that end of the scale. We really come in much earlier than that, so we're much earlier in the scale. So having us involved early can create a whole lot more options than if it's just at the end when it's at a liquidation phase. I think in the current market, we've got a lot of people who are probably moving from that optimistic phase to hopeful phase that they're going to survive, and talking now about some of the out of the box options that we can put in place can really have a positive impact in the long term for a client. If there's nothing else, then I will say thank you very much again, Jacinta. You survived well. You've done extremely well, and thank you all for joining us this month. And we'll see you next month online.